Welcome and hello. This is a video lesson in WRIMS, and in this lesson we're going to be talking about the initial statement and the if statement. These are the two preprocessed statements in WRIMS as described in the Russell Plus reference manual. Okay, so what I have on the screen is my file. This is my main Russell file. Let me bring up the WRIMS user interface, and then also I'm going to show the model schematic. So I'm going to just use this schematic here to demonstrate the preprocessed statements, the initial statement, and the if statement. What we have is two nodes, 1 and 2. There's 100 CFS flowing into node 1, and then 100 CFS flowing out of node 2. So we have a sum of 100 CFS flowing between nodes 1 and 2, which can either take channel A, channel B, or channel C. So the sum of the flow through these three channels equals 100. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at our files now. On the screen now is the main Russell file. This is the file that's called from the configuration that orchestrates the entire script. So what we have here is a single cycle. It's called base. It goes first. And then after that, we're calling the inflow file, the channels file, the constraints file, and the objectives file. So I'm going to go ahead and look at these files real quick, and then we'll introduce the initial statement and the if statement, both of which modify this main.russell file. And that will affect which specific Russell files get included in this particular model run. First up is the inflows. That's this file right here. Basically, we're just saying that inflow equals 100 CFS. Keep in mind here is our model schematic. So inflow is coming in here from the left. We have the three channels A, B, and C, and then the outflow O2 over here on the right. Okay, so back to the first file. The channels file includes the four decision variables, which is channel A, channel B, channel C, and then the outflow. Now we know just from continuity and observation that the outflow has to be 100, but I included it here as a decision variable nonetheless. The next file over is continuity. So here is the constraints file. It just creates two hard constraints, one at each node, node 1 and node 2. So the inflow minus the outflow equals 0 for both nodes. And then finally, the last file included is the objectives file, which basically defines the costs associated with routing flow through each of the three channels, A, B, and C. Now, just from observation, because channel A has the lowest cost, we know that all the flow will flow through channel A, unless there's some sort of restriction or the costs change or the constraints or something else changes. Okay, so let's go back to our main.russell file. And first, I'm going to introduce the concept of the initial statement. From the Russell Plus language reference manual, I'm on the bottom of page 20 here. Pre-processed statements include the initial statement and the if statement. That's what this lesson is about. It talks about the initial statement down here and then the if statement further down. But basically, these two statements are processed only once at the parsing stage and will not be revisited during runtime. In the parsing stage, the variables inside the initial statement are evaluated first, so the if statement knows which files to include. Okay, so as for the initial statement, it can only be a simple state variable or a lookup state variable. These variables are pre-processed only once, and then they can be referenced later on. Right, so it gives a couple examples here. The initial keyword is used, and then open bracket, and then you either define your simple state variable or your lookup state variable. I already created a lesson on state variables, so I will link that in the description of this video if you want a little bit more detail on how that works. But in this lesson, we will have an example of both a simple state variable and a couple lookup state variables within the initial block. All right, I'm going to go back to our main.russell file. And above where I'm defining the sequence, I'm going to add some lines and then paste in my initial block right here. All right, so what I have is three state variables with the keyword svar. The first one is status ID. I'm actually going to change that back to a 1. Okay. So we can go ahead and change this to, any value we want. The other two state variables are phase and CA restriction. So what I'm doing here is defining these second and third state variables as a lookup state variable, where the phase is looking up the value of the phase in the data table, where the status ID column from that table equals the value for status ID, which is 1. Similar thing with this CA restriction variable. It's looking up the value in the CA restriction column. That's coming from the same data table where status ID equals status ID. Okay, what this data table looks like is in my next file over. I've got a video on reading data from a lookup table as well. I'll include that in the description. But basically what we have here, this is the only executable code. Down here is a comment, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But the columns in our data table is status ID, phase, and then CA restriction. So for status ID, that ranges from 1 to 6. Phase, that ranges from 1 to 5. And then CA restriction is either 0 or 1. Now, I wanted to put a phase. I wanted to actually include the construction name phase, which is preliminary, design, construction, review, or whatever. I had trouble doing that. I believe I may have to only use numbers for these tables. Something like strings or Boolean variables may, something was giving me a problem, and that may have been it. But anyway, I just reverted to an ID, and then I included the actual name of that phase down below here in a comment. So the different phases are preliminary, design, construction, review, and closeout. But within the data table, I'm just referencing an ID, sort of like a foreign key, primary key relationship, even though RIMS doesn't actually see this data down here. That's just a note from me. All right, and then same thing with CA restriction. I wanted to use true and false. I had trouble with that, so I'm just going with 0 and 1, so I can remember that pretty well. Phase 2, 4, and 5 do have a CA restriction. I'll tell you about what that means. Same with the phase in just a moment. But the important takeaway from this in the initial block is that we're going to set the status ID here, and then it's going to be used to get the phase and the CA restriction value from that table. Remember, the phase is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and then the CA restriction value is going to be either a 0 or a 1. All right, back to the reference manual. Let's talk about the if statement and then how that initial code block and the if statement work together. The if statement can be used to preprocess file inclusions. The dependent variables in the conditional expression must be defined in the initial statement. So here's the general format. We say if preprocess conditional expression, whether it's true or not. If it is, you include that particular file or files, the Russell files. There's an else if block, which is optional, and also an else block, which is optional. That's what the question mark symbol means. And then here are a couple examples down below. So here we have just a simple if block. If A is plus B is greater than C, then include that particular Russell file. And then down below here, we have if a scenario is 1, 2, or something else, include those particular Russell files. So let's go back to our example. Right here, I'm back in the main.russell file. And instead of channels right here, let's go ahead and utilize this CA restrictions, which means we're going to have a restriction or an upper bound in our channel A, which was the variable C underscore A, if that CA restriction is true or the value is 1. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to give myself a few new lines here. I'm going to comment out this channels.russell file. And then in place of it, I'm going to paste in this code block right here. So I've just pasted in this right here. And what we're doing here is if there is a CA restriction equals 1, then I'm going to include this file, which says channels CA restriction.russell. Otherwise, if there's no CA restriction, meaning the value is something other than 1, such as 0, then we're going to just include the exact same channels.russell file we did originally. So this line of code is commented out, but I just wanted to keep it there to demonstrate that this is the same file. Now you may be wondering, how do these different channel.russell files differ? Good question. Here's the channels Russell file we saw before. We have 4 decision variables. We're going to focus on this first channel here, which is C underscore A. It's a standard non-negativity constraint, but there's no upper bound. And then the other channel file is right here. And what we changed was not the name, it's the same name. It has a lower bound of 0, but it has an upper bound of 40. So instead of 100 CFS, the maximum that it can pass through is 40 CFS. The kind and the units remain the same. Same with these other 3 decision variables down below here, no change. So here's the original channels file with no restriction, and then this is the channel file with restriction of 40 CFS through channel A. So there's that. Let's go back to the main Russell file. Now, further down, we have this file for objectives. And what I'm going to do here is comment that file out. And then based on the phase, we're going to have different objectives. So let me just paste that in. So this is the original objectives line of code down here. This right here is what I just pasted in. What it says is during phase 1 or phase 2, we want to use objectives underscore pre, which is like pre-construction. And then during phase 3, which is construction, we want to use the objectives underscore con for the construction phase. Otherwise, everything else like post-construction review, we're going to have a different set of objectives, which is defined in this third objectives Russell file. So I'll show you what those three files look like. I have them over here. Here is objectives pre. This was actually the one we looked at before, where the minimum cost is through channel A. Over here is objectives con for during construction. Looks like channel A still has the least amount of cost. And then objectives post. Looks like, again, we have minimum cost through channel CA to really exercise that CA restriction and see how that works. Okay, well, anyway, I just made those numbers up. Let's go ahead and run the model a few times. And what we're going to be doing is changing this status ID each time and then looking at how the results change based on the CA restriction true or false, as well as the phase 1 through 5. So let's get started here. I'm going to save all. Everything should be good to go. The status ID is 1. So I'm going to go to my WRIMS here and then run. Okay. So that ran. Here's the DSS file where the decision variables are written to. I'm going to go view, refresh catalog, and then let's take a look at the flow through, well, all the channels is fine. These are the decision variables. I'm just doing a 12-month simulation. It doesn't matter. All the month data should be the same. And as expected, we have all the flow going through channel A here. And of course, that same 100 is always going to be true here for channel O2. That's the outfall. Okay, before I leave this, I'm going to actually rename part F. What I'm going to do is just call it 1, representing the status ID. Okay, so that's been renamed. So next time the simulation runs and I get 4 new results for the 4 decision variables, it's not going to overwrite my existing paths because I've renamed that part F. Okay, so let's go ahead and check out status ID 2. Now, with status ID 2, if I check out the data table, I now know that this phase will be 2, and then the CA restriction will be true. So back to our main file, if I scroll down here, CA restriction is true, which means we're going to be using channel's CA restriction. And then phase 2 is actually in the same if block as phase 1. So it's also going to be using the same objectives. That objective, remember, was causing all the flow, all 100 CFS through channel A. However, with this restriction in place, we can now only route 40 CFS through channel A, which means checking the objectives file, the next lowest cost would be through channel C. So my guess is we're going to have 40 CFS through channel A, 60 CFS through channel C. All right, let's go ahead and save everything and run it and run. Okay, that ran. Let's go ahead and view and refresh catalog. All right, cool. So we have 4 new paths in our DSS file. I'm going to sort these by part F, and then before I even look at the numbers, I'm going to right click and then rename. I'm going to make part F2 for status ID 2. Okay. And then let's go ahead and take a look at those numbers. Here's the table data. Sure enough, we have a maximum of 40 CFS through channel A, 60 CFS through channel C, 0 flow through channel B. Okay, you get the idea. Let's do one more. We're not going to do all 6. That'd be a little bit overkill. But value 3, now status ID value 3, let's take a look at that data table for our phase and our CA restriction. Here it is. Here's table 3. There's going to be no restriction, but we're on to phase 3. So what that means is, here's my model data. CA restriction is off, which means we'll use the generic channels. There's no restriction on the maximum for the flow through channel A. And then in phase 3, we're going to be using these objectives, objectives underscore con.russell. So let me go ahead and find that. It's this right here, which I'm pretty sure we're going to have all 100 CFS flowing through channel A again. However, if we had the CA restriction involved, it would be 40, and then 60 would be through channel B, not through channel C, like we had with status 2. Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what happens. So I'm going to save everything here, back to WRIMS, right click on the launch file, run as. Okay, that finished up. One last time here, let's go view and refresh catalog. Okay, so we've got 3 new state variables. Again, before I forget, I'm just going to update part F with the status ID. by clicking rename, changing state to 3. Okay. And then let's take a look at those numbers. Just as expected, we have all the 100 CFS flowing through channel A. All right, one more thing we can look at if we wanted to click on part B to sort by that field. I can take a look at the flow through, say, channel A for phases 1, 2, and 3 in the same table. So here's that view, 100, 40, and 100 for status ID 1, 2, and 3. That's just another way to kind of organize the data and look at it. And keep in mind, there are 6 statuses. I just only did 3 of them. But we could also look at the data through channel C the same way. Boom, here it is, 0, 60, and 0. All right. Well, anyway, that's all I had prepared for this lesson. It's a simple lesson talking about the pre-processed operations in RIMS, specifically the initial statement and the if statement.